It's the Harris Football Podcast with your host, Christopher Harris.
It's the same song. It is that same old song, but it's a different show. Hey, I'm Chris Harris. This is the Harris Football Podcast. Thank you very much for listening. Very happy to be here. If you've listened to my podcasts in the past, you may have been frustrated. I only got to do 2 shows a week. Well, this podcast will be 5 shows a week. Still, we'll be basing analysis on video, on what I actually see in games, and really kind of ignoring the box score. This show will have guests in the second half of the show. Today, it will be Andy Behrens of Yahoo Fantasy, a good friend of mine. I also hope you realize there's a website, harrisfootball.com. There'll be player videos, the Harris Index, and of course, ranks every single week. And of course, leading up to the season, the ranks are most important heading into your draft. So lots of hopefully smart fantasy analysis for traditional commissioner-style leagues. Something a little different as well. I'm going to have a fair amount of daily fantasy sports advice. DFS, that's DraftKings, and that's FanDuel. We're going to have a couple of segments a week where we discuss the best plays, the worst plays, good strategy. And during August, we plan on having some theory pieces where we talk about the best ways to assemble your team. I think you'll enjoy that DFS content as well. I hope you'll consider subscribing to this podcast on iTunes and rating it if you like it. That would be very helpful. So let's get to today's show.
Today's kickoff.
That's Amber. She'll be helping us out this year. Thank you, Amber. This is the first part of a 2-part preview of the running back position, the most frustrating position in fantasy. We know we're supposed to take running backs early, and they kill us. And we're always tempted to take another position, so going to talk some running back strategy, and then later in the show, I will be bringing in Andy Behrens of Yahoo, and he's going to talk also about the top of his running back board. We're looking at numbers 1 through 20, overall running back strategy, especially in the first round, and we're also going to hit on Andy's absolute favorite kind of league, the scoring format of his dreams, point per reception leagues.
It's time for rankings talk.
So the question leading off every fantasy football draft this year is, who's number 1? And unfortunately, this is a season where most folks are going to tell you there's not a clear-cut answer. I would say if Le'Veon Bell weren't suspended, I would be thinking of him as number 1 overall. I think he might be the best actual physical running back on tape in the entire league. At least his 2014 tape was pretty incredible, but there is that suspension to deal with. I think there's a group of 6 players that you could make an argument that they could be the number 1 running back and thus the number 1 player off the board, but they all have their warts. We talked about Bell's suspension. Marshawn Lynch, huge workloads for a few seasons in a row. Adrian Peterson, he is 30, and there's the question of not having played basically for an entire season. Jamal Charles, really great player, but Niall Davis is there, and Charles's workload was down last year, even when he was healthy, which wasn't always the case. Eddie Lacy, pretty good player. I'm not ready to say he's a great player, but he's on a pass-first offense that uses James Starks a lot. Matt Forte, whom I like quite a bit more, I think, than maybe a lot of fantasy experts do. Yet I acknowledge there's real questions about his workload and the fact that he's going to turn 30 later in the season and that the offense in Chicago is changing. Anyway, we're going to get lots of Forte talk later in the show with Mr. Behrens. But it is a question worth asking, and I get asked a lot on Twitter, at Harris Football, by the way. Please follow me, at Harris Football. Get asked a lot, what do I do in a season where there doesn't appear to be a clear-cut number 1 running back? Should I consider reaching for a wide receiver early on, or should I maintain that traditional strategy? If I'm near the top of the first round, I just go with that whatever highest rank running back is left and build my team from there the more traditional way. For me, if it's one of the first 6 spots in a standard scoring league, I think I'm going running back, and I think I'm going with one of the players that I just mentioned. There are tempting wide receivers on the board. I can't promise you that the likes of Antonio Brown, Dez Bryant, Demaryius Thomas won't provide more reliability and potentially even more upside than some of the running backs that I just mentioned. In fact, the running back position is brutal, and part of the reason to veer away from the running back position early is worry about injury. But the wide receiver position this year is so incredibly deep. I mean, there are 10 to 15 wide receivers who should produce what are traditionally number one wide receiver numbers for fantasy. You're going to be able to take a running back in the first 5 or 6 picks and still get an absolute stud in the second round. I really don't think there's that much of a question. As running back becomes more scarce and there becomes more uncertainty among these, the second tier options, the third tier options, that's all the more reason to take one of the elites at the position if you can, if you're lucky enough to pick that early. Another question, though. That question is, what if I'm not picking in the top 6? At what point do I consider veering away from running back and selecting a wide receiver? And for me, I do think it's at number 7. If those 6 running backs are off the board, number 7 is when I would consider Antonio Brown, Dez Bryant, Demaryius Thomas, and I'm probably not coming back to that running back until very late in the first round or potentially even early in the second round. Now, does film study on any of these guys make them stand apart from the pack? If we're going to rule out things like worries about age, worries about past workload, worries about injury, do the skills of any of these players make them stand out from any of the others? Yeah, I mentioned Le'Veon Bell. I think he might, the slimmer, the less of Le'Veon Bell, might actually have been the best player at this position in the NFL last year. And yes, I'm including DeMarco Murray, whose name I'm now just getting to. He's not in this group for me. Le'Veon Bell stands out as maybe the best. Jamal Charles is close. He's an incredible player, been a favorite of mine for a long time, incredibly elusive, great straight line speed, and terrific in close quarters, terrific near the goal line, a touchdown maker when he gets the chance. Those will be the 2 players for me who I saw on tape last year who stand apart from the crowd. And if you're just going to base your draft on talent, I would be thinking about those 2 guys, and I would be just fine with it. Frankly, I think the order of these 6 players doesn't matter all that much. Of course, the elephant in the room is the most talented running back in the NFL, perhaps of the last decade plus, is Adrian Peterson. And if you told me Peterson deserves to be number 1, I don't think I could argue with you. And if in my draft, if I'm picking 5, he lasts number 5, I rub my sweaty little palms together and I'm just fine taking him there. I'm kind of agnostic about which one of these guys that I get, but if I'm looking for unbelievably great talent, I do think those 3 stand apart from very good players. Listen, Marshawn Lynch is a very good player, Matt Forte is a very good player, and Eddie Lacy is a very good player. But I think in terms of pure talent, in terms of purely what they lay down on tape by themselves, independent of blocking and situation and play calling, those 3 guys are the max. And of course, the reason I say Peterson, is with that top group is because I didn't see tape on him last year, and there is some real uncertainty. One of the warts on him is simply not knowing what you're going to get, as we haven't seen him play for a calendar year. The next tier of running backs have more issues, and that's really how we can think about running backs. The guys who have the fewest issues deserve to be rated the highest. The group that's 7 through 10 for me, Arian Foster, DeMarco Murray, C.J. Anderson, LaShawn McCoy. You can make an argument that the upside of any of those players is as high as the upside of anyone I mentioned previously, but they have a little bit scarier downsides, injury-wise, situation-wise. C.J. Anderson, worry about Monte Ball maybe emerging from the dead. Arian Foster, health issues. DeMarco Murray, Philly issues. Ryan Matthews issues, and maybe health issues. And LaShawn McCoy seems to have the show to himself in Buffalo, but how much is that worth if the quarterback situation is terrible?
Game Film Rewind.
I wanted to move down to number 11, because clearly they're again, we're mounting issues here, but number 11 for me is Jeremy Hill, and I think some folks are going to have him rated higher. I really paid special attention to breaking down his film as I watched this winter in the cold depths of film watching, And I think it would be a mistake to say that Jeremy Hill is a super talented player. I don't think he's untalented. I think he's probably an above average talent. My question with Jeremy Hill is, are we falling in love with the player? Or are we falling in love with the situation? Because situations do change. And, players basically own the skills that they've shown in the past. And Jeremy Hill has shown that between the tackles, he's a bruising runner. He doesn't have dynamic, great speed. He doesn't have dynamic, great side-to-side lateral ability. He'll knock a guy over for sure. He's an excellent goal line threat, a big guy. And I don't want to paint him as incapable of catching the ball. I mean, he had, 20-plus catches in 2014, not starting until midway through the year. But realize that Gio Bernard is there. Gio Bernard himself, a very good player, a past favorite of mine. Maybe a little too small to be durable, but if the Bengals really are going to use a two-headed backfield, then Bernard's going to be in there an awful lot on third down, and I'm not counting on more than 20 catches from Jeremy Hill. It's in his skill set on tape, but probably not a strength, and certainly he doesn't do it as well as Bernard. I think I should also mention, if you're concerned about things like this, and I think you should be, that Hill really isn't the pass blocker yet that Bernard is. It's unfair to say he can't be. He's a bigger guy. I assume he's a stronger guy, and he's only got 1 year in the league, and Gio has 2. But Gio's a better pass blocker, so I really do expect on most third downs that aren't 3rd and 1 or 3rd and 2, you're going to see Gio Bernard in the game and Jeremy Hill not. I know I've heard a lot of folks saying they think Hill might lead the league in rushing this year. I'm worried the workload won't quite be there. I don't think he's a fantasy first-rounder in standard leagues or in point-per-reception leagues. For me, he's more of an early second-rounder. I like the player. I'm not in love with him. I think he's good. If you want the cut-rate version of him on potentially a worse offense, you can talk about David Cobb. I think the skill sets are very similar. Good players, not great, but find themselves maybe in situations where they can be the big back in an offense that needs to run. Of course, Cobb is going to be a mid to late round pick this year, and Hill deserves to go at least in the second round, and I think there's going to be a lot of leagues where he goes in the first. And I have to admit, I kind of think Hill, for me, is almost a tier unto himself. I don't value him in the same group as Shady McCoy, C.J. Anderson, yet I value him fairly ahead of my next group, Alfred Morris, Mark Ingram, Jonathan Stewart, Melvin Gordon, Carlos Hyde, Frank Gore. That's kind of my next group. And boy, you talk about the warts getting worse. I mean, every single one of those players, there's real questions. And you can find my ranks, as I said, on harrisfootball.com. They're downloadable. I also have point per reception ranks. For the moment, I'm giving you my standard league ranks. Someone like Alfred Morris, I mean, not a spectacular season last year, but workmanlike, a very solid number 2 running back for fantasy. I'll sign up for that. I would rather him not be my number 1, but if I find myself in a situation where, late in the second round, early in the third, I'll take him because I think I know what he is, and I feel like that roster doesn't have a huge stock load of great other options. So, Alfred Morris is, as long as he stays healthy, a lock for 200-plus carries, and we know he's not going to catch it much, but he's just fine. Let's put it that way. He's just fine. He doesn't stand out as being amazing on tape, but agile feet for what he is, a very big guy, and a real good fit for that zone blocking system in Washington. Mark Ingram has to deal with C.J. Spiller, the looming prospect of Spiller replacing some of that Jimmy Graham production, and maybe potentially getting some carries, but definitely getting some receptions. So Ingram feels like he belongs right around that Alfred Morris boat. Jonathan Stewart, yeah, he's unbelievably talented, a favorite of mine for a long time, but is he going to stay healthy? There's no D'Angelo Williams in Carolina now, so they're definitely relying on Stewart to be their guy, but can he handle it? Can he stay healthy? He's never done it before. He was terrific in December last year. Some of the best running back tape of the entire season. Melvin Gordon, he finds himself in a great position in San Diego. Rookie running backs always get overrated. They always get overhyped. You're almost better off picking up someone like Gordon the second year if he disappoints in the first. But listen, we've all saw him at University of Wisconsin. Incredibly talented, a breakaway threat. really good player, and I expect he handles the lion's share of the workload, but remember Donald Brown there, Danny Woodhead back healthy. Carlos Hyde, boy, in terms of rookie tape from last year, running back-wise, he didn't get a great ton of run behind Frank Gore with the 49ers, but he was awfully good on tape when he got that chance. And my feeling about Hyde is if the 49ers are better than I expect, I probably have him ranked way too low. In terms of ability, boy, there probably aren't at least 12 running backs whose ability I like more than Hyde's. He's a banger, but unlike Jeremy Hill, I think he's quicker in space and also in the box. I think he'll make a guy miss as well as running them over. So maybe a little low on Hyde, but I really think the 49ers might be terrible this year. Much of their offensive line is gone. Huge question marks in the coaching staff and in Colin Kaepernick. So he scares me a little bit. These are all guys with warts, obviously. And then I mentioned Gore as kind of the bottom of this tier for me. On tape, Gore was last year, 2014, what he's been for the past few years. He's a good player. He's not the player who was a great receiver in his youth or an explosive breakaway threat. In fact, when he got in the open field last year, he got ran down by almost anybody. Linebackers caught him, let alone defensive backs. But the system in Indianapolis, it's the opposite of the system he left behind in San Francisco. It would appear to be an incredible chance to potentially be a touchdown maker in a great offense and also catch the ball occasionally from Andrew Luck. Frank Gore is going to be intriguing, but I can't treat him as a number one, and there are definitely scenarios where he winds up not even being a number two.
Break out the footy pajamas.
Hey, I'm not a Lions fan, Amber, but I take your meaning. We're going to talk about Joique Bell, whom I have rated at number 18 among running backs. That's way higher than a lot of folks have him. I know Bell has a really interesting scenario. You talk about warts. He's coming off of a couple of surgeries that were, over the winter, considered minor. Incidentally, it's kind of easy to consider somebody else's surgery minor. I know for my surgery, I doubt I would be considering it minor. In addition, the Lions drafted Amir Abdullah out of Nebraska, one of the most electric playmakers in college football last year. So there's all kinds of uncertainty and feeling that Bell could just absolutely lose that Detroit job outright, or at the very least wind up in some kind of committee. I have to say, though, I think people are really undervaluing Bell as a player. I think they look at the yards per carry, which is one of my least favorite stats. I'm not a stat guy at all. As you know, I don't like paying attention to football stats much at all. But yards per carry, I think, is one of the most disingenuous crutch stats you're going to find. Yes, Bell is below 4 yards a carry last year, but you ask the Cowboys, you ask how that was to tackle him in the playoffs last year, because he was absolutely tremendous, and he was also tremendous in a huge spot in Week 17 against the Packers. This is a handful of a player. I think if you like Eddie Lacy, you like Joique Bell, because they're really similar players. Bell catches it unbelievably well for a guy his size. He is explosive. He will run you over. The Cowboys experienced that firsthand in the playoffs, but he will also make you miss. He's one of my favorite players in the NFL, hence the footy pajama comment. I get it. Amir Abdullah could wind up being an electric playmaker in the NFL, but he could also wind up being one of those guys who's a little bit undersized and really interesting athlete, but not someone who can take an every down pounding. They're talking about using him on special teams before training camp begins, and he had fumbling problems at Nebraska, and that's not going to stand any rookie in good stead. I'm willing to listen to the Joique Bell detractors for sure. I am willing to see what his health is like. I mean, if we hear that he can't participate through much of training camp or he's not healthy enough to play in preseason games, I'm going to reassess this. But as things stand right now, I think Bell represents some really interesting value if people in your league are assuming that Abdullah is the more valuable of the Lions running backs, or assuming that Bell shouldn't be more than a late-round flyer. I think there's an opportunity there for you to take him. I have him rated number 18 among running backs because I like the film so much, but you probably don't have to take him there. You probably could wait a little bit and grab him later on in your draft for some good value. Rounding out my top 20, which is how far we're going to go in this episode of the podcast, I have Lamar Miller at 19 and Latavius Murray At 20, finally, no Darren McFadden in Oakland. Hopefully Murray keeps that job all year.
Today's guest.
Andy Behrens of Yahoo. How are you? How excited are you to be my very first guest on this podcast?
I am very well. I'm feeling a little pressure being the first guest on this podcast because, this thing could go either way. And I hope to steer it in a positive direction. I hope I don't.
I think it's obvious it could go either way.
I hope I don't torpedo this thing right from the start. That's all.
It's touch and go. You are...
I'm just looking to hand the baton off to future guests so that, nothing can be blamed on me.
You are a veteran fantasy analyst, of course. Unlike some of us, you have to focus on baseball in the summer. So
right.
God knows how much actual knowledge you have. But I'm going to take a chance.
I've just been fully accredited across 3 sports, that's all.
I'm going to take a chance, and I'm going to ask you about... This is our first half of our running back preview show on this podcast. And so I'm interested about your early draft strategy for running backs. I've already given what my top 20 is, and some of the players that I think I might be higher on than some others. My organizing principle for running backs this year is that there's 6 guys at the top, and then a Grand Canyon, and then everyone else. Do you feel that way? I mean, do you think Arian Foster belongs in a top tier? Do you have him at number 7?
So, just generally, I would see it the same way as well. I have basically 5 guys that I would take 1 through 5 in the first round, and then you and I have both been playing obviously for a long time. And it used to be way back in the day that you just had to, it didn't matter if you're in a 16-man league, 20-man league, you took a running back in the first round. You probably took one in the second round too, and that's how you ended up with Deuce Staley as your first round pick or something like that, which was just always a bad idea. And I'm much more, we basically have, Le'Veon is a different conversation, but we have 4 just sort of rock solid running backs at the very top, I think. I don't put Arian Foster exactly in that rock solid, I've got, that is the point. I guess Arian Foster is roughly the point where I break and say, okay, it's time to take Des Bryant, or it's time to take Demaryius, or it's time to take, one of the receivers that I can confidently say is going to score 12, 14 times and give me 1,300 yards. There's a much wider range of outcomes for Foster. 1, because I don't totally believe in his team's offense, and 2, because I don't totally believe in his hamstrings and his, availability to me all year. I mean, that's kind of a weird thing to chase, right? Because as we saw with Adrian Peterson last year, it's not even injury. Like, anything can catch a player. There's no perfectly safe choice. Marshawn Lynch seems impervious to injury until something happens to him.
Sure.
Peyton Manning used to be totally riskless, right? He was always going to play 16 games until he didn't. So I hate to, I hate to overstate the whole injury risk thing because it's present with everybody, but there are multiple things that make me worry a little bit about Arian Foster. And so that is generally where I go ahead and veer toward Des Bryant. I mean, for the most part, I just want to make sure that I get a no doubt great player in the first round, almost without regard to position. And there are some positions that you can take where it kind of, it sets your draft off in a weird, if you take Gronk in the first round, then there's some fallout to that. You've got a plan to do that. But more or less, it's the top 5 for me. I'm curious as to who your 6th is. Maybe it's Matt Forte.
And you, my friend, are a Bears fan.
Break out the footy pajamas.
Thank you, Amber. And you're not including him. He's my number 2 right now, and I know I'm in the minority, having gone back and watched every snap Forte took last year. I know it's a different offense. I know 100 catches isn't in the offing, but you're the Bears fan here. I'm shocked that you wouldn't consider him a top 5.
I think the yardage is very safe, and I do think I think there's this sort of widespread perception that maybe Matt Forte isn't as flashy as the rest of the first round backs. He's better than most people give him credit for.
He's good.
And he's better than that original came into the league as a 4th rounder or whatever. I mean, he's a better player than that. He's a make you miss guy. He's a very fun player to watch. He's obviously proven that he can handle an enormous workload too. I'm just so not, and maybe this is me just being overly emotional about the Bears offense generally. I'm just not I'm not excited for this season. I'm not excited. The team context here seems to me to be all wrong. I don't know that this is going to be a 12 touchdown player, a 14 touchdown player. I just don't see a particularly high ceiling for the offense generally, so that holds me back a little bit. And then there's the added factor where I know people see the reception total from last year, and it looks great. Obviously, he's not going to catch that number of passes again. That was just a function of an offense that was totally broken and unbelievably predictable. He was there were just so many checkdowns that went for nothing that went to Matt Forte last year, and that's just not going to be there. But I do think he's going to be a 4.2, 4.4 yard per carry guy. I think he's going to have a good season. And at the back end of I like him at the back end of the first round. I don't like him
I like him early, man.
I don't like him number 2. Like, I can't imagine taking him over Jamal Charles and Adrian Peterson.
Jamal Charles he's the safe player. He's the one who you're sure is getting 15 touchdowns. Come on.
I feel much better about Jamal Charles, especially under Reed. He's the whole show when they get inside the red zone. I mean, he's the whole show.
He is, but so's Forte. I mean, Forte's much more the whole show than Charles is in Chicago. You might not like the show, but you look at touches.
So I don't know that that's right. I mean, I think Jamal Charles is in a rare class of running back overall, right? He's like the number one running back in terms of yards per carry for his career, and then the fact that Reed leans on him the way he does inside the 5, and I mean, he has the last couple of years he has so many touchdowns that are like 3 yards or less, and that was the one thing that you never got from Jamal. I know there's an injury risk there. I just think he's such a special player that he and Peterson, in my mind, put themselves in a totally separate class, and I guess you could throw Lynch in there too. Totally separate class in terms of ability, which is not to disrespect Forte at all, but I just think the touchdown ceiling for Charles has to be something like 18 or 20. I don't know if he gets there, but I don't think that's there at all for Forte.
Lynch is my number 1.
I get it. I totally get it. That's not everywhere. Not everybody will have Lynch as the number 1, but I mean, this is a ridiculous number of consecutive seasons in which he's, it's the same numbers every year. They're elite numbers, and it's no longer totally accurate to say that they don't, like, it used to worry, well, they don't throw to him, so he gets a little, but that's not totally true anymore, right? He had some huge plays out of the passing game last year. As long as he's getting like 30, 35 plus receptions, which seems to be where he's settled into, you can't knock him in PPR so much anymore either. So there's no flaws there. Yeah.
Well, the flaw everybody's going to come up with is the usage. The workloads have been historically high for all these seasons in a row, but I did a piece talking about basically historically people who've had the kinds of workloads over that number of touches for 3-4 straight years. When have they fallen off? And the age 29 season has not been the time they've fallen off. Age 30, definitely getting there. And he turns 30 late in this season. And then, 31, 32. If you're having that kind of workload that late, you're doomed. It's not going to happen for you. But if people are staying away from Marshawn Lynch as a result of worrying about injury, I think the point you said earlier is apt. I mean, all of these guys are injury risks. It's a car crash 20 times a game. It's a very difficult position to play. I don't think he's more injury prone than anyone else.
Plus, did you not like what you saw at the end of the season last year in the postseason? Right, like he was as good as he's ever been in the biggest moments, like December and January.
Yeah, he was great. So I showed you my running back ranks for the top 20. Was there anything in there other than Forte so high? Which you're not the only one who disagrees. I'm sort of, I obviously want to see what comes out of Bears camp. I'm gonna tune into, various fantasy analysts who live in Chicago's Twitter feeds to see whether Matt Forte visually looks good.
Well, one thing I'll say there's nobody behind Forte who's any sort of threat. Like, that is certainly a point in his favor. There's absolutely no one that you worry about poaching touches at any point. So that's not an issue for me. I will say that relative to me, you're a little bit lower on Shady McCoy. I get it.
Because the Bears offense scares you.
Story for such a variety of reasons.
Right. The Bears offense scares you, but the Bills offense, that thing's going to be great.
Right, okay, I get it.
It's going to be fantastic. What a quarterback Matt Castle is. Oh, what's that? This just in. Matt Castle may not make the roster. I don't know. I agree. There's usage galore there for McCoy, but where do you have him? Where, if higher than 10?
I've actually got him just ahead of Arian Foster. So I go through that first 5,
He's
and then
6.
and there's a little drop for me, and then I go Shady and Foster and Forte. I won't say that I see a ton of separation between those guys, but the path with McCoy to 360 touches, something like that, is just so clear. I have a lot of faith in him as a runner. I agree with you. Again, it's not a case where the ceiling for the offense is so great, so I kind of lump him into that same group as Forte.
Would you say if we have listeners here who are successful in their fantasy leagues and they're having to pick at the end of the first round, which obviously anybody who's listening to my podcasts clearly probably picking last, I assume, title holder. We get a lot of you do too, get a lot of questions that are positional in nature. I'm picking 11th. What position should I be thinking? And I never can answer that question because it obviously depends on the 10 players that go before you. But I like how you alluded to the fact that a long time ago, we were saying take a running back anyway, and the way the NFL has evolved, there is a point at which if everyone has zigged to running back, you feel cool about zagging, especially to wide receiver. We're not endorsing first-round quarterbacks,
even back
but wide
then,
receivers.
though, it was terrible advice at some point because you were taking Deuce Staley ahead of Marvin Harrison, or you were taking Deuce Staley ahead of Randy Moss, who was just obviously going to be 10, 12 touchdowns and well over 1,000 yards. And you're just it's never a good idea to take the 16th best player at a position ahead of the an obvious top 3 player at a skill position. It was a bad idea. It was bad management then, and it would be disastrous management now.
It would be disastrous management now, but I actually think going back and looking at touchdown pass totals in the late 90s, early 2000s, hey, I'm Mark Brunell, and I threw 17 touchdowns this year, and I've ranked 4th.
Right.
It's shocking. You look at those stats, you can't even believe it. You had Peyton Manning going crazy, and Dante Culpepper one year, right? But otherwise, the upside wasn't there.
Oh, it is totally true. Basically every single season passing record is 2007 and beyond.
Yeah.
and they've erased anything anybody ever did before that. That's very true. I'm really only thinking of those top 2 guys. It was Harrison and Moss, and we would let those guys fall to the middle of the second round, late in the second round. That to me was just insane. So that should prepare everyone for their 1998 fantasy draft.
Hey, you back up to your 1998. You take Steve Young. You just don't even think about it. I like Cordell Stewart, number 1 overall.
I saw it happen.
So. Yeah, I did too. We did a league where that happened. Okay, so anyway, yes, Andy and I have been playing fantasy together since the 90s. Aren't we old? All right, I'm going to bring up one final topic, which is near and dear to your heart, which is your favorite league format, probably ever. If you could have it etched on your tombstone instead of your name, it would be the 3 letters PPR. I know how much you love point perception leagues. Tell the folks why you love them so much.
Yeah, so, here's the thing. I hate to be super militant about it, but when people do ask me what I think perfect league settings are, I don't like. First of all, I don't like it when it gets framed as if there's only standard settings and PPR settings, right? Every major provider right now is seriously customizable, and you can do a lot of fun things with league settings. You can do first downs at Yahoo. I like that more than I like points per perception.
First downs.
Well, that's at least that's play with value. To me, where PPR really gets screwed up. Mostly at the running back position. Some of the running backs who just get overstated in importance through PPR just drives me crazy because there are a lot of teams like the Bears last year that just basically use it as an extended handoff. We're talking about a short check down where the ball was in the air for 4 or 5 yards. It was not a play that required great skill. They're not sending Matt Forte downfield, making him run a deep out or anything like that. There's no skill being expressed there that should be the equivalent of 10 yards of field position. To me, it's a game of scoring and of territory. And giving free points for receptions just can't. The idea that a catch for no gain is the equivalent of a 10-yard run to me that's messed up. So and there are a lot of such plays. Then there's all the third down backs who the defense is willing to give you 7 yards.
3rd and 17.
Yeah. They're willing to give you whatever you want. You want 7 yards, you want 9 yards, fine. That's a win for the defense. and we're rewarding that as though some incredible skill has been expressed by the player. I don't love that.
All right, so now I'm going to take away your militancy and say, too bad, there's a lot of people who are listening to this podcast who love PPR, who think it's a really cool and a good balancer for different sorts of rewarding, different sorts of player behavior. And so, too bad, you have to answer this question, which is, if you're in a PPR league, if somebody hog ties you and puts you in front of a computer and makes you play in a full point per reception league, how does your strategy change for running back?
So that's a really good question. You hit on, like, I understand that at some point we wanted to just make wide receivers more valuable. We wanted to make other positions more valuable because the greater population of fantasy players just got sick of drafting running backs in the first round and the second round every year. So I get it. Like, I understand why PPR is out there. I just think there's got to be a better way to PPR, I guess. How does it change my strategy? Generally, it shuffles the running back board in a huge way. Like, I can imagine Justin Forsett as a top 10 running back in PPR settings. It would be very difficult to pull the trigger on that, but he's the guy who is inheriting the role in a Trestman. I mean, it's not just Matt Forte that had the sensational season under Mark Trestman, right? You go back to Charlie Garner. Running backs have been catching 85-plus passes in Trestman systems for a very long time. So I have no problem imagining Forsett being the guy who, I don't know, if he finishes with like 88 catches this year, if he stays healthy, that wouldn't surprise me a whole heck of a lot.
Yeah, that's the problem. He's going to break. I'm
convinced
of
that makes him somewhat difficult to rank because I do have he was hurt a lot last year and just didn't miss games, But like if you owned him.
He's little. He's 5'8".
If you went through the experience of owning him, that you know that it wasn't like an Iron Man season or something, right? Like he was coming off the field all the time, and there were injury notes attached to him all the time, and he gutted it out. But I do very much worry about that. And yet you still have to look at him as a guy who has the potential to catch like 7-8 balls almost any game. So I would elevate him. I would elevate C.J. Spiller a bit. Thinking of other guys, I already like C.J. Anderson, but I think C.J. Anderson can catch a ton of balls. And then, of course, you have to go through the whole – if it's full point PPR, then you really have to knock the guys like LeGarrette Blount, who I think is going to be just probably a steal in standard drafts, but you gotta hit him kind of hard in PPR because he's not going to catch anything. Mark Ingram's probably not going to catch anything. So there are some guys that we feel really, really good. I mean, touchdowns still matter in PPR, though, too. So you can't – You can't kill Ingram over it because he's still in a spot where he could score 10, 12 times on the ground. I mean, that still has value, but full point PPR really throws things. Half point PPR, maybe not so much.
So if you were thinking about that first round again and thinking about that first tier of running backs, does that group of 5 for you change? And or does the wide receiver with a lot of receptions, in addition to his yards and touchdowns, potentially infiltrate that top 5? Or you still say... Same 5 running backs, still above and beyond, still the position of greatest scarcity, still, if I'm picking top 5, I have to go with one of those. Yeah,
I'm still going to have Charles and Peterson at the top of my board. Again, Le'Veon is kind of a separate discussion because you've got to, Le'Veon is obviously going to be a huge asset in PPR, a very good chance that he would be the top per game scorer in a PPR format. The whole thing with Le'Veon is that you've just got to plan for it. Like if you've got a top 3 pick, and I know I'm not going to have this guy like week 1, early weeks of the season. I've just got to plan for it. I've got to map out my whole draft so I can account for his absence early in the year, and then know that I've got perhaps the best running back on the board at the end of the year when it really, really matters. So as long as you can plan for it, I think you're fine. So Le'Veon is still there for me in PPR. Lynch is still there for me in PPR because healthy season. I don't see any reason why he's not going to score 12, 13, 14 touchdowns. And again, these last couple of years, they'll throw to him, So it's not like he's going to finish with, it's not going to be an Alfred Morris season. It's not going to be like a Michael Turner season. It's not going to be 6 catches or 9 catches or something like that. He's going to be comfortably in the 30s. That's fine. You can survive that.
Eddie Lacy's the one we haven't mentioned, and he's clearly okay.
Yeah, and he's fine as well. So those guys are still at the top for me. And then that next group of receivers, maybe you shuffle those a little bit. Like maybe you can feel a little bit better about Antonio Brown than you would. Even still, Dez is going to catch 90 balls. He's going to catch 85 balls. I mean, that first tier of receivers, even that second tier of receivers, they're not like, prime year Vincent Jackson where it's going to be a low total of receptions and hopefully you get 1,200 yards. Those guys all catch 90 balls.
Well, I'll tell you, in my overall top 15 PPR ranks, I got 7 running backs and 8 wide receivers.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. That sounds right.
That top tier of receivers is crazy. I mean, you go from Antonio Brown, Demaryius Thomas, Des Bryant, all the way down to Calvin Johnson, Jordy Nelson, Julio Jones, A.J. Green, Odell Beckham. I like them better than any of the bottom of that top 10.
Yeah, and I don't hear a name in there that I don't think has the potential to catch 85, 95 passes. So, at some point, there are some receivers who get affected by PPR formats, and you are going to like certain slot receivers are going to have a little bit more appeal, but at the very top, there's not, you wouldn't use the PPR format as a reason to separate any of the elite receivers.
All right, man. Well, this was, I hope, painless for you.
Oh, this is awesome. This was great. I'm honored to be your... One thing people don't know, why would they know this about you? Chris Harris is the most gifted fantasy commissioner in the history of fantasy commissioning. It's incredible. You've crafted 2 different league scoring systems for us that are almost flawless. They're complicated, but but they're amazing, and you manage them really well. That is as gifted as you are as a fantasy analyst. There can't be a better living commissioner. You're amazing.
Well, thank you very much, and if only you guys would pay a salary, I could just do that for a living. I feel like that would be kind of the next logical step if I'm that good.
I do feel like if okay, it's Goodell or Chris Harris who deserves $40 million a year for the fine work that they do as commissioner. It's clearly you.
Come on. Bring it on. All right, Andy. Well, you're the best, and you are at Andy Behrens. It's Behrens. People should be following Andy. He is really, really funny and really, really smart, and we've known each other a long time, and you are and continue to be the best, my friend.
Thanks so much, Chris. Thanks for having me.
And that wraps it up. I hope you liked what you heard. If you did, please subscribe on iTunes. Maybe give it a good rating. You'd help out your old friend and make this podcast a success. Remember, go to harrisfootball.com for ranks. I'll be doing player videos. Thanks again.
The Harris Football Podcast's opening theme is Under the Gun by Apex Manor. The end theme is Tooth and Claw by OU Villain. Subscribe to the Harris Football Podcast on iTunes and never miss an episode.